Hello, and welcome back to this week's episode of the TF Cast. My name is Willis Stout.
Hey, Zach here. We are in the solarium today on August 3rd, 2022.
And I am your host, Jacob Bases. And today with us, we're pleased to introduce Bruce Wenzel, who reached out to us about talking about some issues. He is the president of the Neurodiversity Activists on MSU, a student-led organization. And you're here to talk about some ABA issues and other issues on campus and statewide. Bruce, could you just tell the audience the basics, a little bit about yourself and the club, maybe?
Sure. I am, like you said, the president of the Neurodiversity Activists at MSU Mankato. I'm also a graduate student in the Department of Sociology on campus. And basically, our organization seeks to shift the cultural and academic discourse away from what the queer autistic scholar Nick Walker calls the pathology paradigm, which is basically the view that there is one normal neurology, and if you diverge from that relatively narrow view of what constitutes normal, then there's something wrong with you. And we move that discourse away from that view and towards what she called the neurodiversity paradigm, which is the view that neurological diversity is a normal, natural form of human diversity that is subject to the same societal dynamics as other forms of diversity, like oppression and so forth. And on campus, one of the issues that we've been highlighting, especially my efforts over the summer here, is the fact that MSU teaches applied behavior analysis, ABA, in various forms on campus. And that is something that the autistic community especially, but neurodivergent people in general, oppose for various reasons. And I've been petitioning online to get rid of that and ban it in the state of Minnesota. I made a petition on moveon.org that now has almost 800 signatures on there. And I've been speaking with local politicians like Senator Nick Frentz, Representative Luke Frederick. Had a brief email conversation with, what's his name? The representative from St. Peter. Can't remember his name. Jeff Brand, I think?
I think that's correct.
Yeah, so I've been meeting with all of them, and we've been organizing. I got us registered for Pride Fest as well in September. So we've been, since finals week, basically, I set out to launch a counter assault on the ABA industry, and I think we've been pretty successful doing that.
Sure. And you kind of alluded to it here, but there's the kind of a intersection between the ABA and the LGBTQ plus community, and that is that these same practices were used in conversion therapy, and they have not fallen out. Like there's a different social dynamic to how they're perceived in that way. Mm-hmm. Why have these practices continued to be used on autistic people and mostly I shouldn't say it, it's only like 20 states that they've been banned in, but right. It's mostly a negative viewpoint that people have in using conversion therapy.
Right. Yeah. And I think a big reason for that is because they don't come out and say that, pro-ABA faculty, for example, at MSU don't come out and say, hey, we are pro-conversion therapy, because they don't view it like that. They view it as this is, they call it the gold standard of treatment for autism. And, just to sort of deconstruct what they're saying there, I mean, first of all, they're perceiving a minority neurocognitive style as an illness, the way that psychologists in the 60s perceived sexual orientations other than heterosexuality as an illness. I mean, most people don't know that, the World Health Organization removed homosexuality from its list of mental disorders on May 17th, 1990, which then prompted the International Day Against Homophobia, Biphobia, and Transphobia. And as I wrote in my letter to the editor of the MSU Reporter back in April, because autism and various other neurocognitive styles are still classified as mental disorders in the DSM, things like conversion therapy for us are still, they're not perceived as social injustice. They're perceived as legitimate treatments because these neurological differences, which are just as, natural as, sexual or gender differences or ethnic differences, is still perceived as illnesses. And just to give you sort of like the quick rundown of the backstory of all that, in 1961, the Norwegian-born psychologist Ivar Lovaas was hired by UCLA, I believe, to address what they perceive to be these behavioral problems in autistic kids. And so he was inspired by the Harvard psychologist B.F. Skinner. And he developed ABA, Applied Behavior Analysis, and it's basically a system of rewards and punishments ranging from, at that time, electric shock to just like withholding affection from a kid for not, hugging you or something when you would order them to. And so he used this on autistic kids to, in his words, make them indistinguishable from their peers, from their neurotypical peers. And about 11 years later, in 1972, he and his autistophobic colleagues applied these same techniques to queer children, namely gay kids, in the government-funded Feminine Boy Project, which was supported by the National Institute of Mental Health, I believe, is the government project that funded that from 72 to 86. And the reason why the government stopped supporting that in part was because of the queer movements that built up popular support, saying, homosexuality isn't a mental illness, what are you doing? Get it out of here. And, fortunately, they got the people who were in charge of the DSM to get that out of there. And then, as I said, the World Health Organization. But because autism and other neurocognitive styles are still perceived as mental disorders, that is then used to justify the original conversion therapy, ABA, which, as I've told various other, queer activists, is, conversion therapy for LGBTQIA plus people is just ABA applied to gender, sexual, and romantic minorities. And conversion therapy for autistic and otherwise neurodivergent people is just ABA applied to neurominorities. So we're all fighting for the abolition of the same thing. They just don't know it yet because it's called a different thing. And of course, there are various derivatives of ABA, like positive behavioral interventions and supports, PBIS, which is also taught at MSU, and various other things. Sometimes they just call it social skills training. And so that is basically the gist of why there's popular opposition to conversion therapy for queer people, but not for neurodivergent people, because that history has been withheld from them, in the media and in school education, all the way from, primary school through higher ed. I hope, does that answer your question sufficiently?
It actually answers it more than sufficiently.
Yeah, I tend to go off on these. Yeah, thank you. Another thing to highlight would be like, conversion therapy for queer people isn't totally gone either. I mean, you talked about how, less than half the states here in this country have banned it. Conversion therapy for asexual people is still, an issue that is not, most people don't recognize it as much as they do, for example, for gay people. I mean, that's, again, because asexual and aromantic people are still very much pathologized. Like, they think, oh, you have these deficiencies in sexual attraction. It's like, no, this is just another form of queerness. And so the asexual community a lot of the times feels excluded from, pride events precisely because of that issue, because they don't feel included as, hey, I'm also a queer person.
Sure. Yeah, from my perspective, I don't tend to look at anything as being very concrete in general. Like, when I hear the term neurotypical, it sounds weird to me to apply to almost anyone, because there couldn't be more than one, right?
Right.
and it's just it's odd. It almost sounds like I get what they mean, but it sounds just really, it's a really weird word to throw around at all normally, because to me, I read that as like, oh, this person can survive in the system fairly easily.
Right.
And like my whole like last decade of life has been figuring out a way that I can survive and be happy in society in general. And that I had to carve out something really different for myself to make that work. And I guess the point here is that I think a lot of people would look at a person who was ostensibly doing well, like myself, and be like, he's got it all figured out, and he's, a normal dude.
Yeah. It's like, not really.
Yeah, no.
No.
Like, and it almost that would almost be like odd and insulting. 'Cause I don't think that, like, I would be really weird if someone was like, the world is as it should be. Like, we shouldn't change anything.
No, I mean, you're talking to someone who's wearing a graphic T-shirt that says "abolish capitalism." So, like, no, I'm totally, social norms are I mean, you hit on something that, I mean, Nick Walker. I don't know if I can. I'm doing some free publicity for Nick Walker. Her book, Neuroqueer Heresy. She has a whole chapter on this thing she calls. She developed. She took a queer theory and applied it to neurodiversity. And so she came up with neuroqueer theory that, again, we talk about that intersectionality there, where she, talks about how no one is born, neurotypical, just like no one is really born, for example, cisgender. When we say someone is cisgender, we just mean that they are born with certain potentials, certain proclivities that may make it easier or harder for them to conform to these social norms. Like, our society is very heteronormative. It says there are only two genders, and men are supposed to act and think this way, and women are supposed to think and act this way. And if you diverge from that, you're a behavioral problem. And with neurotypicality, what she calls neuronormativity, that is entwined with heteronormativity too. Like, we just say there are only neurotypical people, and if you diverge from that definition, then there's something wrong with you. And she's saying, like, when someone identifies as cisgender, that just means that their innate tendencies, they internalize those external social norms and say, yes, I identify with this. I identify as cisgender. Like, this definition is more or less a good fit for me. Like, this suit fits. But neurotypical, it's like, really what it means is your brain functioning more or less fits this narrow definition of what constitutes normal. And those of us who are born autistic or kinetic, which is the neurodivergent affirming term for people who are, diagnosed as ADHD. I, by the way, am multiply neurodivergent. I'm kinetic and autistic. So I diverge well away from what people say, oh, act like this. Like, no, I'm not going to sit down and shut up for 8 hours a day. I want to get up and move around and think about, philosophy and, process the university for, being complicit in what Walker herself calls the war to subjugate neurodivergent body minds.
Is this being taught alongside
her book or like the material? No, again, like one of the reasons why her and a bunch of other neurodiversity activists and scholars have been, so loud about this, and why I've been so loud about it on Twitter and in my articles and, creating the organization at MSU, is precisely because, just like in the 60s, a majority of the discourse was saying, like, if you look up psychology articles in the 60s, it was all about, treating homosexuality as a disorder. Mm. And then they had this movement where they're like, you have to get rid of all this literature that's homophobic.
Yeah.
And start over, because it's, people talk about, for example, Senator Scott Dibble out of Minneapolis, when he was pushing for, what was it? Was it Senate file. It was either Senate file or House file 1871, which was the one he was pushing to ban conversion therapy for queer people back in like May. And there was this reporter who asked him, what would you say to people who are saying like, making the counter argument, who are like, oh, conversion therapy is a form of treatment and it's the right thing to do. What would be your response to people who believe that? And he said, I would just tell them to look at the science, all the psychology studies that say that this is harmful and traumatizing to people and, makes them suicidal and whatever. And I look at that as a sociologist and I go, yes, obviously I agree with you. All the research that is coming out now is saying how this is a horrible, terrible practice and we should get rid of it. But the problem is the institutions that are publishing that research now are the same institutions that were supporting conversion therapy when it first was coming out. And the World Health Organization didn't like have a revelation and go, oh my gosh, we've been so wrong and we have to get rid of this. It was because of pressure from activists who forced them to get rid of it.
Certainly.
So, I kind of lost track of your original question, but like that's basically.
I was asking if like some of this stuff about
right. It's not like the norm, just like the norm in the 60s and the 70s was to teach, queerness as an illness. The norm in most universities today is saying, autism, mental disorder, treat it with ABA. Being kinetic, mental disorder, treat it with this. Being schizophrenic, bad. Put them in, prison, lock them up in asylums. Being bipolar, bad. They don't have, again, the research that's being done is being conducted by researchers who are operating under an assumption that Walker calls it a neuroprovincial assumption, that there's only one right neurology, which is just as delusional as saying there's only one right sexuality or gender identity or ethnicity or culture or whatever. And one of the things that I find very ironic is that, MSU Mankato's motto is big ideas, real world thinking. But their curriculum as it exists right now, what they teach there, does not reflect the really existing diversity of human minds. So for them to say real world thinking, it's just preposterous.
Yeah. It's kind of difficult because when I think about this, I have an ADHD diagnosis.
Hey, we have another neurodiverse in the room. We have a kinetic person. Hey,
I'd never heard
what's
that.
What's up, neurokin?
I had never heard kinetic either. I'm also ADHD.
Sweet. Ah, cool. Wait, are you NT or what?
I don't think
know.
I'm undiagnosed.
Yeah,
No.
okay.
If there was one person who was probably like neurotypical to a fault, it's Willis.
Okay. He's the only one right now in this room who doesn't have a graphic tee on. That's the indicator. You got. I don't want. Yeah. But no, I mean, like, I enjoyed that little laughter there for a second. I forgot what you even asked, but like, yeah, no. So like, I mean, it's just ridiculous. It's like teaching a campus that, white people are the only, correct race or something, which of course, leads to the whole, crimes that we committed against the indigenous people back in the day.
Well, how do we identify ABA teachings or systems in our institutions and schools and dismantle those? Like, what are some trademarks of ABA?
Some like, red flags and things that like countermeasures. So oftentimes it'll just be, they'll teach a class. For example, like Angelica Aguirre on campus teaches the graduate level advanced applied behavior analysis class. Like it'll usually just be, let me back up for a second. Red flag in general is just, if your university has a psychology program, it's probably teaching ABA because that is so ingrained in psychology. Now, the field of psychology doesn't have to be inherently bad. Like studying how the mind works is actually like, yeah, that's a useful thing to know. The problem is that psychology has in the past and still does to this day, it has been leveraged. Like pseudoscience does still exist in that field that, oppresses minority groups. And so you got to look for, does this professor, like if you look up their resume or you click on their profile online, do they teach ABA? Are they a board certified behavior analyst, a BCBA? What does their research say? Do they use person first language? Do they say children with autism versus autistic children? Do they... I mean, it's for us, it's pretty obvious because, again, this is, things we've have to endure our whole lives. So it's like pretty easy for us to see. But, they use very sort of jargony terms like early intensive behavioral interventions. It's just a derivative of ABA. Positive behavioral interventions and supports. I mean, to quote one, neurodivergent activist, PBIS or PBS for short, not the TV channel, but like the derivative of ABA. PBS is just ABA with different letters. And there is a website, the Therapist Neurodiversity Collective, and they have a list on their page on ABA where it lists like all the like 20 or something derivatives of ABA. And so you have to basically be like an amateur sleuth. Like you almost have to be your own like independent investigator and look through what is this person's background? What are they doing? As far as countermeasures, I mean, one thing would be to even just, join our group at MSU. Like hit me up on Twitter at Bruce W. Wenzel. Email our RSO advisor, Beacon Medea Russell, who works in ResLife. You can find her contact info on the MSU website and the ResLife page. Join our organization. We're trying to organize an online panel of other activists for August 31st, which is the 5th International Day of Protest Against ABA. And we're trying to get people from all over the world to, scholars like Nick Walker and so forth to, put pressure on the university, like get rid of this. Don't go around saying that you're here to promote diversity on campus and, cultivate a safe environment for students when you put it, you expand a Chick-fil-A in the CSU, and Chick-fil-A, by the way, is a notoriously homophobic business. Queer students don't like it there. And, you teach ABA as part of the curriculum. So, and then, sign our petition on moveon.org, ban autistic conversion therapy in Minnesota. Call up Governor Walz's office. Tell him you want him to sign an executive order getting rid of this stuff. There are all sorts of things you can do.
It sounds like one thing I heard in there that I want to touch back on was that in some of our systems and institutions, we're operating from a set of assumptions that are just fundamentally flawed. And so those are sort of where we need to identify those and make them aware where, we've maybe missed something, go back and redo some of that work.
Yeah, I mean, Nick Walker in her foundational essay for the neurodiversity movement, which is in her book Neuroqueer Heresies, and is online on her website Neuroqueer, and was originally published back in 2012. Her essay is called "Throw Away the Master's Tools: Liberating Ourselves from the Pathology Paradigm," and she references Audre Lorde and all sorts of like feminist activists. And she says, yeah, it's this paradigm shift, this shifting of viewpoints starts internally with us. We have to first challenge our basic beliefs about neurological diversity pertaining to the human race. Like, yeah, isn't it ridiculous that we think that there's only one normal way for the mind to function and like there's only one right neurology? Like, yeah, that's just this, dubious as saying there's one right gender.
Would like to meet the person who I understand how that's like socially implied,
right?
But like, is that some way, like, is that like real popular thinking within academic circles that there is some kind of right pathology of thinking?
Well, the thing is, most people aren't aware of their own dubious assumptions.
Oh yeah.
They don't even know that they're operating under assumptions. They just think, oh, this is what I heard growing up, and that's like they don't even, which is ironic because they'll pathologize autistic people and from things like the theory of, the mind blindness theory by Simon Baron-Cohen, which, by the way, can I swear on this show?
Oh yeah.
Sure.
Fuck Simon Baron-Cohen. Fuck that guy.
You heard it here. Fuck him.
Yeah, fuck him. Fuck that guy. Like, he came up with the mind blindness theory, which basically says that autistic people lack empathy because we can't put ourselves in the shoes of other people. Like, we can't shift, like, we can't, like, you know, if we're having a conversation and let's say like you're neurotypical and I'm autistic, and there's, you know, there's a communication problem, like, you know, there's just some misunderstanding along the way, just as there is in any conversation. That then causes the majority of people, the neuromajority and neurotypicals, to blame all communication failures on autistic people. Like, oh, it wasn't something that I might have done. It was just all you because you have a communication deficit. It's funny that they'll go around saying that we lack social awareness and self-awareness when they themselves are unaware of just how dubious their own thinking is. Like, they're not aware of the fact that they're autistic-phobic. It's like, stop projecting your flaws on me. You're the one who's self-aware, who lacks self-awareness.
That makes sense. Yeah, if you were just to assume like, oh, I always communicate well, and now I don't communicate well with this person.
We all fuck up.
Yeah.
We all fuck up. Like, you know, one professor who did give me some pretty solid advice a while back was, you know, give yourself permission to fuck up and try again. I mean, that's just life. Like, don't be afraid to screw up and, you know, correct your mistakes when, you know, someone reveals to you that you screwed up. Like, that, I can't tell you how many times. I mean, if I had a nickel for every time I've been socially rejected by neurotypical people because they thought something they did wrong was my fault, I would have reparations for everybody for ABA abuse. Like, so the idea that, yeah, I mean, it starts with just even informing people that there's such a thing as assumptions. It's like, hey, here's what you said. Like, if someone was saying something homophobic, I mean, they don't even know that. Some of them don't even know what homophobic even is. It's just like, hey, you said this thing. That stems from the assumption that there's only one right sexuality. Well, wait a minute, what's sexuality? Then you have to explain that to them. Well, there's heterosexuality, there's demisexuality, there's bisexuality, et cetera, et cetera. And you have to, it's very much, I love how this circles back to sociology. C. Wright Mills is the author of The Sociological Imagination, big old, you know, educator. He, at the end of his books, you know, he advocates you have to start from where they are and build up from there. There are some people who are just so bigoted that it's not healthy to interact with them, and you just have to stay away from them. Shout out to J.K. Rowling. But there are some people who are open to learning. Like, we got Teddy Roosevelt back there laughing at my jokes. But like, there are, you know, a good group of people who just, you know, they say, for example, autistic-phobic things, and they just don't know any better because that's what they've been trained. You have to sort of gauge who's open-minded enough, who's flexible enough to be open to being wrong, because that takes a lot of courage. Most people aren't brave enough to admit their own ignorance. And there are, unfortunately, a group of people who, like, no matter what you do, no matter no matter which way you go about it, it's not worth your time and energy.
You know, that kind of circles back a little bit to something I was thinking about earlier when you were talking about how psychology doesn't necessarily need to be anything or have like a moral decision.
Nick Walker is a somatic psychologist. There are plenty of pro neurodiversity psychologists.
But my point here is that I imagine that a lot of this stuff comes from a company, organization, or some kind of, you know, profit-driven motive, speaking to a psychologist and saying, these behaviors don't work for us.
Right.
We need you to solve them.
Right.
And they produce that answer, and it becomes the correct answer, because that's how research is funded. You know,
right.
Like universities pay for it, or a private entity pays for it.
Right.
And that's how I imagine every, you know, way that I was ever asked to sit and sit still, or, you know,
yes.
All of those things come from someone seeking that answer. And I do think now, from when I went to school to even right now, they do a slightly better job of dealing with that.
I've noticed that too. I mean, I remember when I went to West High School here in Mankato. I mean, geez, like circa 2012 was terrible at West High School for me. It was so overtly, bullying was everywhere. From what I've heard, I mean, things have loosened up a bit in terms of like, there are more, for example, there are more like boys now who are like coloring their hair and not being called, homophobic slurs for it. So like social attitudes have improved a bit. But you talk about, for-profit entities influencing, scientific development and research and all that sort of stuff. I mean, that is the role of the anti-autistic hate group Autism Speaks. And most people probably listening to this will probably think, wait a minute, hate group, Autism Speaks, they're the most popular organization. No, they were funded. Just because you're the most popular organization does not mean you're the most moral one. First of all, Autism Speaks was not founded by autistic people for autistic people. It was founded by the former CEO of NBC and an executive for General Electric. So, can't be more capitalist than that, right? Like a big business guy who founded this organization after he found out his grandson was autistic. And the organization was founded firstly to find a cure is in air quotes here, to find a cure for autism. And because he was very rich and he got his, big old business friends to, help contribute to the organization, they grew and became huge, and they made all of these very, just horrible commercials. Like they did this ad campaign. You can find it on YouTube now. I mean, there's this commercial called "This Is Autism," which was directed by Alfonso Cuarón, the director of Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban. And it's this like couple minute. It's essentially this short film that portrays autism as a disease akin to like worse than cancer.
I think this was like in like 2005-ish.
Autism Speaks was founded in 2005, and I think that commercial dropped around 2009, if I'm not mistaken.
I like vaguely remember this, and I've actually heard of this issue. I was a little bit surprised when you sent me all the stuff that I hadn't heard of some of these things.
Most people are surprised when I send them stuff.
And
it's like a pattern.
I was aware of the Autism Speaks thing and being unpopular within people in the autistic community.
Yeah. Actually, autistic people hate Autism Speaks because it's like, to quote Walker, it's like the most ironically named organization ever. Like it's called Autism Speaks, but it actively suppresses autistic voices.
Yeah, and
it should be called Autistophobes Speak.
Oof. Sorry. Funny, not funny.
Yeah, and again, to smash the fuck you, Simon Baron Cohen, to smash the stereotype that autistic people lack humor. I've made like a group of 3 other guys laugh this whole time.
Yeah, and you wouldn't be doing any of this if you couldn't put yourself in other people's shoes.
Yeah, I mean, I tweeted out something that got quite a bit of upvote, like support on Twitter. It was this thing where I said, and I tagged Simon Baron Cohen in it. And I was actually quite proud of it, where I said, you don't need scores of scholarly studies to disprove Simon Baron Cohen's mind blindness theory. Just one word: masking. If autistic people couldn't anticipate what allistic people, non-autistic people, were thinking, we couldn't anticipate their actions, then we wouldn't live in the closet out of fear of being bullied, institutionalized, or murdered.
Oh, sure.
So it's like, I don't need to write an academic article to get rid of your theory.
That's one of their words, is masking. Like
the autistic community, that's what because it's basically like it's the autistic equivalent of living in the closet if you were gay. Like, we're just going to suppress what we're really thinking and just act like the majority of people just so we can get by without any sort of antagonism.
Like not like info dumping or like things like that.
Right. Yeah. Like, hey, you asked me a question and I won't go on for 3 hours.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah. Or I'll just put up with the fact that they teach ABA at MSU and not protest about
Yeah.
it. That would be masking.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for me, when I was in school, and it was the thing that always got to me. I talk about it in my stand-up. Is
We do stand-up, awesome.
Yeah, Jacob does as well. It's like people calling me like gifted, or saying that I'm like more capable than what I'm like producing, because it was just like, well, it seems like you're telling me I'm failing, and like gifted is just such a stupid, it like point out the ungifted kids.
It's a very icky term. Like when people say gifted, what they really mean is like, it's very patronizing. It's like, oh, you're so gifted compared to like what?
That's always what it is. Yeah.
Yeah. It's like,
point out the ungifted kids to me.
Right. Yeah. It's like, it's just so yuck. I mean, like it ties back to like, functioning labels. This person's high functioning or low functioning. It's like, who gets to determine the proper function of a human being?
Well,
we're not machines. I mean, you would call like, a gay guy who's living in the closet, who's, masking as straight, would be called a high functioning gay guy because he's not authentically acting gay. It's like, it's the same thing with an autistic person or a kinetic person or someone else who's intrinsically neurodivergent. It's like, there's no such thing as a high functioning autistic person. There's just an autistic person who's more easily conforming to neuronormative standards.
It's just how much do you want to mask or not?
Right.
And what are you comfortable with?
Yeah. It's like you're high functioning. The more you mask, the higher functioning you are. The less you mask, the lower functioning you are.
And it's kind of insulting to both parties, because if someone wants to be more comfortable behaving either way, it doesn't matter.
Yeah. And I mean, neuronormativity doesn't just enslave neurodivergent people. It also, to a certain extent, enslaves neurotypical people, because it tells them you can't do certain things. Like there are cisgender heteronormative men who grow up internalizing the gender norm that says they can't cry or something. Like the only emotion you can experience if you're a man is anger, which, then it leads to a whole bunch of, psychological problems and toxic masculinity and abuse and all that sort of, amazing, great stuff. Sarcasm. Autistic people are capable of it. And it enslaves women too, because it says like, women can't be pissed off from like misogyny. It's like, that's bullshit. So it's putting everyone, it's basically forcing people to act like cheerful robots, to steal a term from C. Wright Mills. Like, it's just another way to make people act like machines, basically.
Well, I guess I just see the primary problem as being, even when we talk about high and low functioning things, I think of that entirely in terms of like social standards. Like if I were to hear someone say high functioning, I would think this person is able to, like, without additional support, no matter who they are, be a member of society. And actually, I see this attitude a lot of times from people who are trying to like dismiss their own bigotry, where it's like, if only I wouldn't have to do anything to facilitate their lifestyle, I wouldn't care what it was. Like if I wasn't involved in it, then it would be just fine. But it's like, no, they want me to do something on their behalf. If I didn't have
to care about someone other than myself, everything would be just great. It's like, that's the other thing. We're like, it brings up this, story I brought up on Twitter that actually got quite a few of the things I'm finding now, as someone who, has basically just been told to shut up and sit down his whole life. It's very refreshing for me now to be on, Twitter and get support from, people saying like, yes, I relate to that too. And, the whole lacking empathy, caring about other people, solidarity thing. Again, that's just another, neurotypical projection, where I can recall last spring when I was in social psychology, we were reading this article on things like, domestic abuse, battered women, that sort of thing. And the authors were advocating for, we got to like help support women and, domestic violence victims and stuff like that. And I was walking up the hill to get to campus, and I saw this, I was on like the right-hand side of the road on the sidewalk. And then on the left side was this woman who was like very visibly distraught, like breaking down, crying, sobbing. And she had like this cart of her belongings, and she was outside of this apartment. And all these cars were going by and nobody was stopping. And I turned around and I walked across the street, dodged traffic, and I went up to her and I asked, what's wrong? And she said that she'd just been kicked out by like some drug addict or something or whatever. And she said she was hard of hearing and didn't want to call the police because, that the police can make things worse in situations. And so I was trying to figure out how to help this person. And again, it's like, oh, but I'm the one who lacks empathy. Really? Because I just saw all these neurotypical people drive past this woman and not give a shit. So,
well, they're just high functioning members of society.
Right, yeah. The less you
somewhere.
care about other people, the higher functioning you are. Which is, it's like, well, then call me low functioning.
Yeah.
Because I care about a lot of people. Snap, yes. There's yes.
Well, what are some impacts here? Like, what are we? So there's some things that have been like publicly done. Like I was able to read some of your stuff in the Free Press and in the MSU Reporter. Mm-hmm. Has any of that that's out there? People can read it,
yeah.
And people can listen to what you say here.
Yeah.
Have there been any
other victories?
Yeah, like has anything happened at the university? Have people within the department even recognized that you said a thing?
Oh yeah, did you read my thing? Yeah. I mean, there are quite a few people who have come up to me and said like, "Hey, I read your article. It was really cool." Like I talked to a couple of like librarians about it. There's some employees there who've read it. I mean, my thesis advisors read it. There are people in the student activities office who've read it. There are people online who've read it. I mean, Nick Walker herself, who follows me on Twitter, she's read it. Nick Walker, by the way, is a trans woman, and there are other activists online. I mean, there are AutCollab, the autcollab.org, the website of Autistic Collaboration. Jorn Betten, one of the founders of that organization, the antithesis of Autism Speaks, like something that was actually created by our people to support our people. When I alerted him to our petition on Move On to ban ABA in Minnesota, he put that petition. He put us on the AutCollab website's index of international efforts to ban conversion therapy. So our petition that I wrote over the summer is getting international attention. And there have been people who, I mean, again, as we were talking about earlier, we have almost, last time I checked, we have roughly 780 signatures now. And I made that 2 months ago. And so not only are there people in Mankato, in Minnesota in general, who have signed it, people from out of state have signed it. There are people from out of state, there was one person who, people can comment on the petition and say, this is why I signed it, and this is why I support it. There's one person on there who said, I'm autistic and I plan on moving to Minnesota soon. That's why I signed it. Because, I don't want to go to a state that is doing this. So, I want to go somewhere that's safe for me. People from other countries have seen it, and some of them can't sign it because their zip code doesn't work when you try to enter it in to sign it. But yeah, there are plenty of the biggest victory actually happened outside the U.S. recently. Chile became the first nation in the world to officially recognize neurodiversity and civil rights for neurodivergent citizens in its constitution.
That's awesome.
Yeah, and I wrote about that in my article for the Free Press.
Yeah. One thing you just kind of, went over there quick with someone relocating to Minnesota, and this is topical for other reasons, just regionally, as long as we live under this red court, as we do and will.
The supreme joke of a court.
Yeah. As long as this happens, they're going to continue to deregulate things. and they'll probably come for a lot. And I think people will end up relocating to states that have more robust protections for, things like abortion or...
Absolutely.
Yeah. And so I think we will see refugees more and more as these things come down.
Yeah.
I imagine that marriage equality will be on the docket in the next 3 or 4 years, if not sooner.
Yeah. I mean, they're going out. I mean, that's the overturn, for example, if I can jump off that real quick.
Sure.
The overturn of Roe v. Wade is especially important, for example, for the autistic community for a couple of reasons. I mean, the big one is, and this was something that Nick Walker had mentioned on Twitter right after it happened, and then I commented on, where she was pointing out that when you make it legal, when you allow states to enforce banning abortion, that can also be used as a precedent for states to force people to have abortions. So they can go the opposite direction and say, oh, we, for example, like Autism Speaks has partnered with Google to do these, eugenics projects for screenings for, is this kid going to be autistic or something? Fuck Google too. It's like, hey, if we do, picture a hypothetical scenario where, the state does a prenatal test on, for example, a woman who's pregnant, and they are like, oh, we think your kid is going to be born autistic, therefore you should have an abortion. That's genocide. That is preventing births of a minority group. And so Walker was alluding to that, which she was talking about that, and then I jumped off of it and I said, yeah, this, with the overturn of Roe v. Wade, that sets the stage to prevent births of autistic people, and it sets the precedent for forced sterilization of autistic people who are already born. Very similar to things that have happened in other minority groups as well. And with the overturn of Roe v. Wade, just to put one final pin in that, ABA, as Walker and other activists like myself have pointed out online, it grooms, because it's denying autistic kids their bodily autonomy. It grooms them for sexual abuse. And when you overturn Roe v. Wade, and you have all these people who, I think there was a study that came out of France or Europe somewhere where they had said they found that 9 of 10 autistic women experience sexual abuse. And of course, the numbers are also high for men and, non-binary autistic people and whatever. When you put them through ABA and then you legalize, and then you ban abortion rights, you've just set autistic people on a path to hell. That's terrible. So it's even more important that we get rid of ABA. And also, ABA isn't just applied to autistic people. It's also applied to kinetic people. There are some people who are starting to, think about applying it to neurotypical kids too, because again, it's just trying to get that social conformity in there. So it's in everyone's self-interest to get rid of this now before it gets even more out of hand than it already has.
Well, Jacob, did you have another question?
No, I was just gonna ask, how do we direct people to interact with you or your organization, or if anyone feels so inspired as to learn more or do more, how do they get in contact with you?
Well, my DMs on Twitter are open. My username is at Bruce W. Wenzel, Wenzel. There's no capitals. It's all lowercase. There's no special characters in there. I have my MSU email address, bruce.wenzel@mnsu.edu. I mentioned my RSO advisor, Bika Russell. Look for her on the MSU page, the website. She's in Res Life. If you're at all, associated with the LGBT Center on campus, Stephen Thomas, the new director of the LGBT Center, reach out to him. He knows me. We're very involved. Student activities. If you just even want to, there are people who work there, you say, hey, can you you know, the neurodiversity activists, you know, Bruce Wenzel was recently on this podcast. What's his email address? I'm sure they could probably give it to you. On our petition on Move On, there's a little button at the top where it has my name. There's like a little email icon. You can click that button and it'll send me an email that I can reply to. Yeah, there's tons of ways. I mean, if you're in Cato and you ask around, you can probably find me.
Sure. Yeah, and I just had one last comment because I think this is really cool.
Sure. This has been really fun, by the way. Thanks for having me on here.
Yeah,
for my
thanks for being on.
Yeah, my podcast debut.
Yay.
Bruce reached out to us, and like this. Normally, we scout people pretty far in advance, so it was really nice for someone to come with us with, you know, their like something that maps pretty well over what we cover on this podcast.
Yeah.
So, you know, that said, if you're ever listening and you think of people who are eligible or like they got something to say, there's something topical that's going on in this area, affects Southern Minnesota, and, you know, aligns with our values, by all means, send us an email. We got info@tfcast.
triplefalls.org.
Yeah,
info@triplefalls.org.
Yeah.
And Jacob's got my phone number, so like, you know, even just reach out to these guys. They'll direct you to me.
Sure. Yeah.
We'll take out a billboard and put your phone number on it.
Yeah, I'll be looking forward to that. You know, yeah, totally. I mean, on that note, like I have a meeting with my RSO advisor Biga tomorrow to organize our, you know, our international panel for Protest ABA Day on the 31st. So like, you know, now more than ever, if you want to support us and reach out, by all means do so.
Cool. Well, thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me. It's been awesome.
Thanks.